I am absolutely delighted, ladies and gentlemen, that I have the privilege of inviting António Guterres to speak to us. This, I think, if I counted correctly, is the fourth time you're speaking here, but it is only the first time, or is it already the second time? The second time as Secretary General of the United Nations. In your earlier capacity as High Commissioner for Refugees, you came to speak here in 2014. That was the year that was already mentioned when President Gauck spoke and when Ursula von der Leyen supported and initiated this discussion about Germany's larger political responsibilities. It is an enormous privilege for all of us to have you here, Mr. Secretary General, and I would like to invite you now to address the audience. And just to remind you, after the Secretary General's speech, that will be followed immediately by the statement from the Emir of Qatar. Mr. Secretary General.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's an enormous pleasure for me to be back since last year's session. And if I remember well, last year on discussing the global threats we are facing, I concentrated on, in the absence of clear power relations, the multiplication of new conflicts, and at the same time the fact old conflicts seem never to die, be it in Afghanistan, in Somalia, or in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And indeed, when power relations become unclear, unpredictability and impunity became the name of the game, and as my grandfather used to say, there is no longer any respect. And so things happen, conflicts appear everywhere with devastating humanitarian consequences. And I remember having noticed that those conflicts are becoming more and more interrelated and more related to a threat of a new global terrorism threat to all of us. If you look at the map from Mali to Nigeria, to Libya, to Somalia, to Syria, Iraq at the time, to Afghanistan, Yemen, all these conflicts are interrelated, with people fighting, going from one to another, with people then going back to their countries of origin, and all these conflicts are clearly related to this new threat of global terrorism. Now, we also noticed that in this context, dramatic violations of international humanitarian law, human rights law, and refugee law were taking place, with people suffering enormously, and that it was practically impossible to guarantee accountability in relation to these terrible violations. Now, 1 year afterwards, I have to recognize that the situation has not improved. On the contrary, the problems I described remain, but we have two new qualitative changes that make things considerably worse. Number one, for the first time since the end of the Cold War, we are now facing a nuclear threat, a threat of a nuclear conflict. And I'm naturally referring to the developments in relation to nuclear weapons and long-range missiles by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, a development made in total contradiction with the will of the international community and in clear violation of several resolutions of the Security Council. It is important to note that the unity that the Security Council has been able to demonstrate the will of the international community and has been able to put through sanctions a very meaningful pressure over North Korea. And that pressure, in my opinion, is absolutely essential to be maintained, but that pressure also creates the opportunity for diplomatic engagement aiming at the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, a denuclearization I believe we all want to be peaceful and within the framework of a regional security framework. It is true that in recent weeks we witnessed an improvement in inter-Korean relations. I was myself in the Olympic Games of Pyeongchang, and it is always with emotion that we see North Koreans and South Koreans together in a competition like this one. And of course, the fact that the dialogue between the two Koreas was reestablished is a positive one. And especially the fact that the hotline between the military of the two countries was reestablished is an important factor to avoid misunderstandings and escalations. But even if the relations between the two Koreas improved, let's be clear, that is not the central question we are facing. The central question remains the question of denuclearization. And the question of denuclearization, in my opinion, requests that we all engage actively in order to be possible for, I would say, the two key stakeholders in relation to this crisis, the United States and North Korea, to be able to come together and to have a meaningful discussion on these issues. I believe the United States is ready to do so, and recent statements by the Vice President demonstrate that. It's absolutely essential to keep the pressure over North Korea and to convince North Korea that it is absolutely vital for them to come to the table and to be able to find a way for this denuclearization, the peaceful denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, to be possible. Obviously, there is a role for all the other countries of the so-called six-party talks. Obviously, there is a role for the international community. It is very important that we all abide by Security Council resolutions. It's very important that we all participate in this need for pressure over North Korea, but it is also important not to miss the opportunity of a peaceful resolution to diplomatic engagement, as a military solution would be a disaster with catastrophic consequences that we cannot even be able to imagine. The second qualitative change that I believe exists relates to what we are witnessing today in the broader Middle East, where I think we are facing a true Gordian knot. We always had conflicts in the Middle East since the beginning of civilization. And in the last few decades, we got used to a succession of conflicts and crises, but always with this idea, perhaps naive, that the international community would be able to deal with each one separately or in succession. We have witnessed the Arab-Israeli conflict and then progressively transformed into a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We have witnessed the civil war in Lebanon and then the conflict between the Hezbollah and Israel. We have witnessed the different conflicts in which Iraq got involved and the most recent developments in the country. And finally, with the so-called Arab Spring, we have seen the conflict in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya. But as I said, until recently, we always got the impression that things were more or less under control, and each of these situations could be handled separately, even if it was more and more obvious that there was an interrelation among them. And that interrelation became even more clear when Daesh, with its operations, made the Iraqi crisis and the Syrian crisis so obviously interconnected. What I think has changed clearly is that today the whole global Middle East became a mess. And became a mess with a number of different fault lines that are completely crossing each other and interconnected. The fault line that remains between Israelis and Palestinians, the fault line that represents the memory of the Cold War, that is still there, the fault line between Sunni and Shia. And if you look at these fault lines I described, and it is clear that there is a very special position of a country like Iran that has a fault line with Saudi Arabia and its allies, a fault line with Israel and a fault line with the United States, all these things naturally making the situation extremely complex. And more recently, I would say a Sunni fault line, very clear in relation to the crisis of the Gulf Cooperation Council, that has, I'm sure, many reasons explaining it, but in which a central aspect must be the different perspectives that exist about the role of the Muslim Brotherhood in the context of the region. Now, all these different fault lines crossing each other have created a situation that is an authentic quagmire. And if you look at the perspective of the different countries, that quagmire becomes more and more evident, with the possible exception of Iraq, where even if things could have gone tremendously wrong, if there was a civil war after the referendum in Kurdistan, the truth is that it was possible to overcome that difficulty And I've been in Kuwait just 2 days ago, and there was a very clear show of confidence of the international community in the process of stabilization in which Iraq seems to be embarking at the present moment. And let's hope the elections will confirm the vision of a democratic, non-sectarian Iraq. But with this exception, all the other situations are getting worse. The Israeli-Palestinian peace process is in a dead end. If one looks at Syria, after the hopes created by the de-escalation that has reduced the conflict in several areas of the country, the truth is that we are now seeing a reignition of that same conflict in Idlib and in eastern Ghouta with dramatic humanitarian consequences. We have seen the Turkish operation in Afrin. We have seen chemical weapons again reappearing. We see risks of fragmentation of the country. And I remember that in the past, Israel used to look into the Syrian conflict as some kind of a distraction in relation to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But in my recent visit to Israel, I could notice that the perception of the presence of militias very close to Iran, close to the Israeli border, and the perception of a potential arc between Tehran and Beirut, allowing for the enhancement of the Hezbollah capacities, seems to be, to many Israelis, as an existential threat. And the events of just 1 week ago show how dangerous this can represent for the situation in the Syrian context. And I would say the worst nightmare we might be able to face would be, and I know that both Israel and Hezbollah do not want it, but the worst nightmare would be a new war between Hezbollah and Israel that would mean the devastation of large parts of Lebanon. And we know that any sparkle can trigger it, and that we are far from being reassured that that conflict is impossible. On the other hand, we see that in Yemen, still no chance of a political dialogue starting. At the same time, we see that the difference of perspectives in the Gulf Cooperation Council has not only very complex implications within the Gulf, but it has now destabilizing effect in Somalia and in other areas of the Horn of Africa, which means that all these situations seen together represent what I said, a Gordian knot. Obviously, we have not been idle in the United Nations. We are actively engaged in any initiative that can relaunch a peace process that seems to be, as I said, in a dead end in relation to Palestinians and Israelis, with a deep belief that only a two-state solution can address both the interests of the Palestinian people and the Israeli people. We are totally committed to relaunch the Geneva process, finding a political solution for Syria, the inter-Syrian dialogue in Geneva, now that in Sochi it was possible, and I have to pay tribute to the Russian Federation on this, to fully abide by the engagements that were taken, and to guarantee that Sochi was not a parallel process, but on the contrary, was reaffirming the role of Geneva and channeling into Geneva the results of what was decided there, fully in line with the Security Council Resolution 2254. And we'll do everything possible to reactivate, to energize the Geneva process. At the same time, we are totally committed in supporting the stabilization of Iraq. Just to give you an example, the United Nations is involved only in Mosul in 700 projects that employ about 10,000 people, which means how strongly we are committed to help Iraq regain its role in the region. And we'll do everything possible also to stimulate the possibilities of a political dialogue to take place in relation to Yemen. And simultaneously, we have been supporting the Kuwaiti mediation and the efforts of the United States of America in order to make sure that the Gulf Cooperation Council crisis comes to an end. But it is obvious that we are dealing in a fragmented way with the reality that is now a holistic reality and requires a common vision. And it's the common vision that is absent. And if in relation to the Korean situation, we see the unity of the Security Council, unfortunately that unity is completely absent in relation to the situation in the global Middle East, and in particular in relation to the situation in Syria. Now, I believe that there is an effective risk of escalation in several of the areas of this region. And some of these forms of escalation can have absolutely devastating consequences that it is difficult for us even to imagine. And that reason justifies, in my opinion, that even if the contradictions of interest of both the global powers and the regional powers are clear, I think the threats for all of us and the threats for them, first of all, would justify a serious effort to come together and to try to cut this Gordian knot. There are several interesting suggestions on the table. For instance, I remember that during the Cold War, the old Cold War, the Helsinki process was an important moment to help the two groups come together and establish a platform of discussion. And when I look at the Cold War in the Gulf, I ask myself whether something similar could not be put in place, allowing for at least some forms of dialogue to encourage these countries to come together and to find ways to address the very complex contradictions that they face and the very complex difference of interests that indeed exists. The situation in the global Middle East is, in my opinion, today, a qualitatively different threat that we face that requires the mobilization of all our efforts in order to be able to fully address it. Let me say a few words about another global threat that I believe is more and more in the concerns of us all, and that is related to the cyberspace. When one looks at today's cyberspace, it is clear that we are witnessing, in a more or less disguised way, cyber wars between states, episodes of cyber war between states. And the fact is that we have not yet been able to discuss whether or not the Geneva Conventions apply to cyber war, or whether or not international humanitarian law apply to cyber war. I think it's high time to have a serious discussion about the international legal framework in which cyber wars take place, and I think it would be essential to use what it is the competence of the First Committee of the General Assembly of the United Nations to do it, and to do it sooner rather than later. But the concerns go far beyond cyber war. The concerns relate to what it is today, the permanent violation of cybersecurity, what it is the multiplicity of hacking activities, some by states, some by different actors, some even by amateurs, what are the different uses that criminal organizations and terrorist organizations are making of the web, all of these creating a level of threat that is becoming higher and higher, and for which we have not yet found an adequate response. Not only the different methods of regulation, both at state level and through international conventions, do not easily apply to a situation like this, but there is even an absence of consensus in the international community about how to regulate the so-called Internet of Things. I'm one of those that defend that only through a multiple stakeholder approach we will be able to make progress. I believe it's necessary to bring together governments, the private sector involved in these areas, the civil society, the academia and research centers, in order to be able to establish at least some basic protocols to allow for the web to be an effective instrument for the good. I don't intend that the United Nations has a leadership role on these, but I can guarantee that the United Nations would be ready to be a platform in which different actors could come together and discuss the way forward in order to find the adequate approaches to make sure that we are able to deal with the problems of cybersecurity, especially now that artificial intelligence that is providing enormous potential for economic development, for social development, for the well-being of all of us, are also, in the opinion of many, an existential threat for humankind. All these creates the need for a serious effort in which we need to all embark to be able to have, in relation to the web, a proactive form of, if not traditional regulation, at least the level of discipline that would be necessary and the capacity to take into account the ethical values that are necessary to make it an element for the good of mankind. Now, it is clear that all these threats are taking place in a context in which simultaneously we feel that climate change is running faster than we are, in which we feel that inequalities are growing in the world, even if the progress generated by globalization and technical development is enormous, and in which we feel that governments and other entities have been unable to properly manage the problems of human mobility, of refugee and migration flows. And all these facts combining are creating levels of mistrust between public opinions, citizens, and political establishments, and international organizations like the UN that put into question the cohesion of societies and also that create doubts about globalism and multilateralism. And this is a reason why I believe we need to be able to unite. We need to be able to affirm that global problems can only be addressed with global solutions, and that multilateralism is today more necessary than ever. That unity is essential if we want to combat the polarization of our societies, and if we want to affirm the importance of multilateralism. And this is also the reason why I'm so committed to the reform of the United Nations, to make the United Nations more able to respond to the needs and aspirations of we, the peoples that generated this organization. But it is also very important that we unite ourselves in order to make sure that the Paris Agreement is respected, and with an enhanced aspiration, with an enhanced ambition, as we are all aware that even the commitments made in Paris are not sufficient in relation to climate change. That we engage together in making globalization a fair globalization. And we have, through the Agenda 2030, an important UN contribution for what could be a meaningful debate for a global cohesion in relation to the global development process. And especially to engage ourselves, to unite decision makers, leaders all over the world, to understand that the peace and security problems that we are facing today are so serious, at the level of threat is so high, that it's much better to come together than to persist in the level of divisions that we are witnessing today and still paralyze the Security Council, for instance, in many of the dramatic crises that we face. It might be naive to think that with the level of contradictions that exist today in the world, that unity is possible. But I think it's even more naive to believe that divided we can survive facing the challenges that we are facing in today's world. And so my strong appeal is to overcome our differences, to overcome our contradictions, and to understand that to face all the challenges that today is facing, we absolutely need to come together. And this is the raison d'être of the United Nations. And this was the vision that led many visionaries in the end of the Second World War to create the United Nations. And what I believe we need is to learn with what happened with the League of Nations to make sure that the same will not be repeated at the present times. We need to understand that the level of threat we have demands from all of us a much stronger bet in the cohesion of our societies and in the unity, building a true and strong multilateralism to address the challenges of the present times. Thank you very much.